Thank you for the invitation to speak to you today. I've always enjoyed First Saturday as a community, and I'm sorry that we're actually not able to be together, but I'm hoping that the next time I get a chance to talk to you that we'll all be in the same place. I also want to acknowledge I found out last week that Dr. Charles Wu passed away. And if for those of you that know him or did not know him, Charles Wu was a professor of Chinese language and culture at Reed College and was a critical person in the creation of the Lanzhou Chinese Garden. He translated Chinese poetry. He actually had his PhD in English literature. He was from Shanghai. And that as an author and as a great scholar, he also put together then the book that has all the literary associations and the couplets and the poetry that is part of the Lanzhou Chinese Garden. His loss is deeply felt, and so I wanted just to bring that to your attention in case you didn't know. And as you are aware, that this year has been just terrible in our nation, with these deep cultural and political divides, the racial violence, the more recent racial violence against Asian and Asian American communities. That is just rending our social fabric. And we've also experienced, as Dennis was saying, these incredible natural disasters that have occurred, increase in migration, in homelessness. And then on top of this, of course, this global pandemic that has already taken over 500,000 loved ones away from us in the United States. This pandemic has just so profoundly changed how we live and how we work and interact with one another. And I'm sure that that many of you have experienced the same kind of Zoom fatigue that we are having. During the last year, when I wasn't preparing lectures or teaching, I was actually out in the garden to escape Zoom. And over the course of the year, my family basically retreated to our small urban garden, which became a refuge, a retreat for us. And certainly it was a joy to plant seeds. And let's see if I can here move my, oh, wait. Okay, this thing I have to do like this. We would plant seeds to nurture flowers and vegetables, and in some cases they fed us far more than in more ways than one. I am a gardener. I'm sure that many of you on this Zoom call are gardeners, and that it was interesting to me that while so much of the country was shutting down and there was so much retraction in our economy, that actually the retail garden industry boomed, that there was over a 10% increase across the board. And it was that garden centers, retail garden centers were described as essential services. This is not surprising, given the fact that this concern, this desire to turn to the garden in times of hardship is something that is universal. It's very ancient, and we're going to be discussing this in terms of looking at Chinese painting. So a very large increase in that. The other is that this desire to go out in nature, because we could not be together indoors and it was safe to be actually outside in the wilderness, that in fact our wilderness areas, national parks, state parks, were really got a lot of use. I read something that in the Deschutes Forest, there was a 30% increase in hikers through that, because we couldn't, again, gather safely indoors. We escaped into nature. But my idea for this talk was really inspired by the Lanzhou Garden itself. And during the time when the garden was entirely shut down at the start of the pandemic, the Lanzhou Garden created videos that then they would send out with links, email links via email, to Vimeo, this platform that allowed us then to get this glimpse of gardens. And this one is one that was, I did the screenshot a couple of months ago, but it says the Lanzhou Lovely Moment #2, to notice that in fact there's over 2,000 people that looked at this, watched this 1-minute brief video that gave us a glimpse of a place that we loved, that gave us a sense of calmness in watching this. It was a break from what was the turmoil of that time, and provided this sense of closeness to nature. Basically, the garden, like we have here in our own personal gardens, were places that we longed for. They were places also that we could use to nourish ourselves, this retreat that this mental and physical retreat that we needed. And so it was through this that, in considering the idea of retreat, of how then also Chinese paintings over the centuries have provided a similar purpose, a similar method of retreat, so that even landscape paintings for these Confucian officials during the Song Dynasty and after, they could be working within the capital themselves, not be able to escape from their desks, and they could look at scenes of nature. They could look at landscape paintings. They could look at examples like this of Zhao Mengjian's Three Friends of the Cold Season, and it would give them that sense of escape. And that these became crucial objects, certainly the paintings themselves, the images themselves, but also then how they created a sense of community amongst these Confucian scholars. So the title that I've got, this Scholars Retreat, Loss and Resilience in Chinese Landscapes and Gardens, really reflects this, that both in good times and bad, that how these paintings then functioned in this way. It's important to remember also that most of the paintings I'm going to show you today, and I've just pulled out a few, are paintings that were done mostly by the Confucian scholarly elite. These were the people that were the most educated. And starting in the 11th century, when China developed this meritocratic bureaucracy amongst Confucian scholars, that these were the people that were so deeply educated in history and literature. They saw themselves as the continuators of culture, no matter what, in good times and bad, that they would then preserve this tremendous history and tradition that they had. These were technically private works of art that were meant to be passed around amongst and were shared with other members of their community, of this community of like-minded, educated friends. They depend also then on literary and historical references in order to communicate, in order to really get across the messages. And so the examples that I've chosen today are actually painted by people that are either in times of extreme political stress or a time of deep personal disappointment. And I wanted to explore these over the last year with this pandemic. Even though I've been studying this material, looking at these paintings for 40 years, I began to really see them in a different way and consider them in a different way. And in that way, it's kind of a continuation of this concept of Chinese painting as something that is always living, that the biography of the painting and how people look at the painting is a crucial aspect of its biography, how they come down to us, the reception of them. And so what I really want to do is take you through several of these paintings, starting with this example by Zhao Mengjian, starting actually very close to some of the kinds of things that we see at the Lanzhou Garden, and look at these as examples of resilience and what they can tell us about how we move through this period, how they are meant to inspire us, and how they inspired then the people that saw them. So that is where I'd like to begin. That question is, what can we learn? What are we going to take away then from looking at these? And so I want to begin with a painting that is of plants and motifs, things that we would actually see at the Lanzhou Garden. And for those of you that have been there, those of you that are docents of the garden, you immediately recognize this as the three friends of the cold season, a painting that shows pine and plum blossom and bamboo together. It looks like a bouquet. It looks like a gift because there are these pieces of the plants that have been cut and put together like it's his gift. It's a bouquet, and we know these certainly these images as. See if I can move forward. It's not working. Oops, gotta go this way. As best wishes for the new year. We have just recently passed through this period of the new year, the Lunar New Year that was in February. And that the reason why these are associated with the new year, of course, is that these are all alive at the start of the new year. That the pine tree itself, let's see if I move it. These is, as we're going to see, is associated with the Confucian scholar. But all of these images are actually, and motifs are found in the Scholar's Garden. And I think they're actually carved on some of the screens that are in the Lanzhou Garden because they illustrate the virtues of the Confucian scholar. And things like the plum blossom that is associated with the purity and virtue and refinement. It is the first flower that blooms, and it can bloom during the time of snow. The pine that's associated with longevity, perseverance, and strength. And of course, the bamboo that is a symbol of resilience, the lack of ego because it is hollow, and also utility because it can be used, that the scholars were meant to be useful. Now, how this takes on other shades of meaning is by the artist that actually painted this. Zhao Ming was a scholar in the very, very late Southern Song period. He was a descendant of the Song imperial household. He had a very elevated position within the court itself. And that because he is in the waning days of the Southern Song period, right before it fell to the Mongols, was destroyed by the Mongols, that it takes on a different meaning. And instead, what we have because of this is that Zhao Ming and the biography would have been known, that the people looking at this painting would have known his life, would have known what he faced, especially as a descendant of the Song royal house. That this then took on the association of moral strength in the face of adversity, particularly in the face of political adversity. That there is a sense of loss that is provided here by this. So this theme, this sense of strength in adversity, especially in political adversity, becomes part and parcel of this particular theme of the three friends of winter. So the context of the artist is particularly important. Okay. We can also need to consider then the artist's life always in the life, the moral strength in this face of adversity, but also biography of the artist themselves becomes a crucial aspect in how people would then interpret these paintings, how his friends that saw them and the generations after that would know his story would have interpreted. Now, in terms of the idea of retreat, and one of the most important themes that appears is the concept of exile and as an aspect of retreat. And this is also another painting by Zhao Ming, I don't have the dimensions of this, unfortunately. It's a beautiful painting of an ink orchid. These are terrestrial orchids, and with very grassy foliage. It grows in the mountains. And because of this, it has the association of fragility and fragrance. It's something that's considered rather rare, and it becomes a symbol of virtue, and especially becomes associated with, with a particular person named Chu Yuan. That what we find happening in painting beginning at this time, actually we describe it as something that's actually happening earlier, is that certain subjects are tied then to cultural heroes that express this concept of virtue as a man of principle. And orchids are one of these, that as they grow in the Lanzhou Garden, we of course are the garden of the awakening orchids, that is a part and parcel of this particular theme, is this sense of virtue and purity. It becomes a symbol of exile due to a person of Chu Yuan, who was a 4th century BCE scholar. He was an advisor to the king or prince of Chu, who Chu Yuan was slandered. He was sent into exile, being involuntary retreat, but he becomes a cultural hero because he is both a statesman and this extraordinary poet who wrote some of the most influential verse of early China. And Chu Yuan becomes a very, very important icon for all later scholars, especially those that are laboring under adversity or sent into exile. Chu Yuan is a tragic figure because he was sent into exile and unable to alert his prince to a threat of the empire. He was so grief-stricken that he drowned himself in the Miluo River. And so he's considered this, again, a martyr for the state. How orchids come into this is the fact that he wrote poems about planting orchids in his garden while in exile, and his delight in those. So all orchids then, these orchids, especially ink orchids, because in ink painting that becomes so strongly associated with Confucian scholars, that is at its heart, one of the associations is of exile. So again, because Zhang Sixiao is only a few years away from the Song dynasty being destroyed, that later viewers look at this painting and they understand Zhang Mengjian's his message, which is of exile, that the Song dynasty was going to fall. How orchids then continue on. I just wanted to show this example because it is so extraordinary. The currency of this theme does not go away, especially in the following Yuan dynasty, which began in 1279. The Yuan was the Mongol-ruled dynasty that swept down, finally destroyed the last remnants of the Song, abolished the examination system, basically gutted the bureaucracy, and gave the Confucian scholars at court one of two options. They could either serve a foreign government that they felt was extremely distasteful, or they could retire. They could go into reclusion, and which was voluntary, was their choice. But the fact that many of them did not serve the government, that they were loyalists to the Song, that was considered to be a really principled, of an extremely principled stance for them. And this is one of the people that followed that route, was a what they call an imin, a leftover subject. This is Zhang Sixiao's painting, dated 1306, so just about 50 years after Zhang Mengjian was painting orchids. He was a member of the court and at the time of the fall of the Song dynasty, and refused to serve the government. And this is this kind of this political recusal. But I just wanted to point out how very different then we have the simplification of this depiction of an orchid, that as opposed to, let's see if I can go back here. There we go. The extremely elegant example of Zhao with the kind of fluidity of the ink, the sense of naturalism there, that when we get to Zhang Sixiao, it is radically altered. It is radically simplified into just very, very few strokes, brush strokes, and in fact that there's no ground that is depicted there. What we have starting in the Yuan Dynasty is oftentimes a real simplification of the visual field, simplification of what we see, but instead there's the addition of poetry that really tells us then what the artist was thinking, that these were both poets and painters, calligraphers. They put all of this together into one package. So what Zhang Sixiao did, his painting and poem that he asks, or that he poses, I've been asking Xi Huang, the old hermit, with my head bowed, who were you and why did you come to this land? I opened my nostrils before making this painting, and there, floating everywhere in the sky, is the antique fragrance, undying. And he calls himself Suanan Wang. This is on the right-hand side where you see this inscription there, meaning south-facing old man. It means he's turned away from the north, turned away from the Mongols. This is a poem that expresses this tremendous sense of loss. It reflects also then, he talks about this antique fragrance that is undying. He's looking to the past. He's referring then to Chuyuan in his exile. There is also a statement about this painting where it's recorded, not in the poem itself, but when Zhang was asked why he didn't paint any ground, there's no grass around this, he said the reason why was the barbarians have stolen the ground. So political reclusion, retreat, oftentimes has this tremendous sense of grief as we're seeing there. Another main theme is one of voluntary retreat, what we describe here as reclusion and for purposes of escape, that oftentimes what are described as in terms of Confucian reclusion is after a scholar, a bureaucrat has served his government, because of course that was the highest goal, was to be able to serve in the government. That once that they had completed that, the desire was to escape that dusty net and instead return home. And really the model for that is a person named Tao Qian, who again is in this case, a 4th to 5th century poet and statesman. The painting that we're looking at here is a close copy of one by Chen Xuan, who was a great Yuan painter. He was a very accomplished scholar and bureaucrat, extremely brilliant. And at the fall of the Song Dynasty, he became so disgusted with the failure of Confucianism and the Southern Song court to save China that he burned all of his writings. He refused to enroll as the head of household. Essentially, he tried to erase himself out of Chinese history. He turned to painting to support himself. And his themes, whether they are landscapes or flowers, often express this kind of devastation and grief at the loss of China. And so this copy, which is a close copy from the 14th to 15th century, is his depiction of Tao Qian, and who is the kind of iconic figure associated with voluntary retreat, with reclusion. Tao Qian, like Chuyuan, was a statesman who served at court. He was sent into exile multiple times and then brought back when he then refused to serve the government. And as he decided it was going to be better to live in poverty than to serve a corrupt ruler. So it reflects this kind of mark of virtue and patience, or excuse me, a principle of deciding to do that. He was a great poet. The title of this is Ode on Returning Home, refers to one of Tal Chen's most famous poems called Returning Home, which establishes this whole field and garden poetry theme. And it's about him fleeing from what was a very elevated position in court to the most humble abode possible, that where, and he talks about in poems the joy of farming, the delight in picking chrysanthemums. So this theme that Chen Xuan is doing, this painting of after Tal Chen, alludes to his poetry, his life. This is always relevant for anyone that is choosing to move into seclusion. And so this is the poem, that this is Chen Xuan's poem about Tal Chen. And what you notice in this is how is the kind of overlay between these two figures. How Chen Xuan, who was painting in the 13th century, 12th and 13th centuries then, is referring to someone who lived 400 years before, is identifying with that person. So in front of his gate, he planted 5 willows, which we can actually see the willows. By the eastern fence, he picked chrysanthemums. In his long chant is a lingering purity. There is never enough wine to sustain him. To live in this world, it is necessary to become deeply drunk. To take office would only bring shame. In a moment of inspiration, he composes Returning Home, the poem of 1,000 years. But anytime we see references to Tal Chen, we know it is about this mark of this principled person. But there's also something else that's interesting about the way that Chen Xuan painted this, and that is the colors, the brilliant colors that we have here, which is described as this blue-green style that we see both in Buddhist painting, early Buddhist painting. It becomes important in the Tang Dynasty, which is one of the golden ages of Chinese history in terms of poetry especially, and the strength of the court. So it's an allusion to great things in the past. It also becomes associated with this idea of paradise. And so the combination of these elements of referring to Tal Chen back in the 4th century, of looking to what is the glorious past of China, really emphasizes then Chen Xuan's distance from that in how he was living then during the Yuan Dynasty. So reclusion becomes particularly appropriate theme in turbulent times. It never really goes away. Now, in terms of landscapes, we've moved from people then to landscapes. And I want to talk a little bit about how landscape itself, just looking at mountains and water, and what's described as shanshui in Chinese, which means landscape, how that can also then express the sense of grief and desire for retreat. And how this works is that it depends on a model from the, in this case, from the Northern Song period, that landscape is crucially important. And because it reflected, by the time we get into the 5 dynasties Northern Song period, from about the 10th century through the 12th century, we have the imperial court deliberately establishing images of and the motifs of the mountain itself with the emperor, and that the trees are the loyal ministers, and that the idea is that as harmony, as when the natural order, as we would see out in the world, of all things in their place, is something that reflects the order and hierarchy and stability of nature, that this is the perfect metaphor for Chinese society, that harmony in nature reflects and depicts, is a metaphor for harmony in society and government. And also then by extension, that the harmony in nature that we see reflects also the moral and ethical rule of an emperor. So it is a direct relationship that how what is happening, and this is part of Neo-Confucian thought, but what is happening in the world is a direct reflection of the moral and ethical rule by a good emperor who has the mandate of heaven. How this gets employed then, in an example like this is extremely interesting. This is a painting by Guo Xi, who was a painter in attendance to the Shenzong Emperor in the Northern Song, that he was a theorist in addition to being a painter. He writes a long treatise on landscape painting and how there are landscapes that are painted into ramble and others in which to dwell. He writes extensively about creating landscapes and what they should do for us. But as I said, how in the 11th century we have then these motifs that are codified as symbols of the emperor and his subjects and of the loyal ministers. We know specifically some things about this painting that make it really extremely political. First of all, this is directly tied to political reforms, to tax reforms actually, that were instituted under Shenzong by the Prime Minister Wang Anshi, and that were extremely controversial. But Guo Xi was called to paint this painting of early spring in order to show that the tax reforms were working, that actually that they were bringing all of nature and society in harmony. And so what we can see, what we have here, is this enormous mountain. Excuse me. It looks always, this painting always looks to me like geologic time has been sped up. Excuse me. And because it's got this, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not actually in doing this, but I don't think you can, but it has this almost a spiral shaped mountain form. And that at the bottom there, that what we see, that there is a hierarchy in landscape so that the figures at the bottom are very, very tiny. But what we see then are fishermen, the lowest, in this case, the lowest social level of hierarchy. And we can actually then follow figures that move through this landscape. Just up there on the left a little bit, there are figures that are walking into a distant plain. As we move up higher, oops, sorry, wrong direction, we can see waterfalls. And as we ascend then in height through the landscape, we see then elegant palaces. And at the very top then, there is nothing. The mountain itself is what is reflecting then the emperor. Down below, I just wanted to point out here, in this rocky outcropping, which is the way we visually move into this painting, that there are trees that have double trunks. Whenever you have double trunks of trees, in this case pine trees, that's a good omen. And the pine trees, again, are associated with the Confucian scholar that are here in attendance to the emperor that is this immense mountain. So double of anything, there would be double flowers, double heads of grain, any of that, again, is indicative of a good omen. So this indicates a little bit about, again, how these were used, but what this also then provided for the following dynasty, the Yuan dynasty that I've talked about just very briefly, looking at Zheng Zixiao and Qian Xuan, is that it provided a vocabulary of motifs that could be combined and rearranged, and that functioned, therefore, as landscapes of descent. So landscape as a subject becomes used to different ends. It has different meaning. And one of the best examples and one of the most famous of the artists, it becomes incorporated into a group that's described as the four great masters of the Yuan dynasty, is this person named Ni Zan. And this is his painting called Rongxi Studio. This is actually done 4 years after after the fall of the Yuan. And but it is really basically comes out of Nizan's work. It's a continuation of Nizan's work. This is very near the end of his life. Nizan was a very wealthy, highly educated individual, a person of extreme refinement. He was also a Song loyalist, one of these Yimin, and he expresses this sense of disenfranchisement through motifs in this painting, and also through his own personal style. Remember, I just showed how the trees were attached to the mountains. They were on the mountains. That what Nizan is doing here is he's splitting this landscape apart. That in fact, the mountains are way in the distance, and they look to be almost that you almost can't see them because of they're so far in the back. And that in front, in fact, this area in the front is dominated then by several rather spindly, thin trees and an empty pavilion. This composition emphasizes that distance from the emperor. The Chinese emperor has been removed and is far, very, very far away. The color, the treatment of the ink, you can see here, is extremely thin. These paintings don't reproduce well in photographs. If you ever get a chance to go see a Nizan, do. The ink seems to float over the surface of the paper, and they seem to shimmer. Those little dots that we see there on the back of the mountain, or even floating on the rocks in front, they seem to actually float. It looks as you could just blow this thing right off the page. What this emphasizes and suggests is this kind of extreme purity, this dry silvery ink that no other artist is really able to duplicate ever in the history of Chinese painting following this. But it also really, we don't see any people here. And paintings, and Nizan's paintings always give a sense of this kind of isolation, that the pavilion is entirely empty, that no one can inhabit this landscape, that everything is so far, far distant. And this is really, describe this as being a mind landscape. It's not a real place. There's no way it could be a real place. You could not walk in there. And in fact, a physical person would be, wouldn't fit there. The style itself that we see here, how it reflects this kind of resilience and perseverance, is this incredible control he has over the ink. That, and here we're looking at the background mountain there, how far away that is. The kind of ethereal nature of this painting, and the supreme control that he has in the brushstrokes, the individuality that we see of the painting itself is his vision. And it really emphasizes that sense of resilience, of perseverance, that certainly his life, the story of his life would be known, that his political stance as a loyalist, refusing to serve the government, would also have been known and would have been read through, as in later, both his friends that would know this, would see this during his lifetime, and later viewers then would know Nizan's story and would be inspired by that, and would understand, in looking at the painting, how it reflected his life. That it's in the Yuan Dynasty where we have the individual brushstroke described as the heart print of the artist, and that you are meant to see through the strokes themselves to be able to see the heart of that artist. This is how Chinese painting is meant to work through time, and even up here to the 21st century, as we are then looking at these paintings, even in slides. these paintings, as I said, were made oftentimes as gifts for people. Rongxi Studio was by Nizan. This one also is. This is by another Yuan Dynasty painter, Wang Meng, who again is living here at the end of the Yuan Dynasty. This is very different than the rest of his paintings that are oftentimes very large, hanging scrolls that depict retreats and that are enfolded in mountains. And I really struggled with whether or not to use this one or one of those, but I decided I would use this because it is so personal. This is a gift. This is the only surviving fan painting by Wang Meng. It dates to 1361. It's called Sparse Trees and Pavilion, and that is a name that was given to it by collectors or people that saw it later. This was made for a friend, Chen Ruzhi, who in the poem is called Wei Yin, who was a friend of Wang Meng. At the time that Wang Meng and Chen Ruzhi were living, this is the very end of the Yuan Dynasty, when the regions in which they were living, their ancestral states, where they lived, was subject then to rebel bands as that were basically, there was so much social and political turmoil at this time. The degradation of really the social order in China began during the Yuan Dynasty in like 1340s, 1350s. And so it had this period of 20 years before the establishment of the Ming Dynasty, when this whole area was overrun by rebel factions, by peasant uprisings, and particularly in wars between competing armies that were raised by local warlords, by Han Chinese that were trying to establish that government and were trying to establish a new dynasty. So you have the population that is fleeing war. That Chen was the person who received this painting, was effectively homeless at this time. He was a poet, and he came to stay with Wang Meng at Wang Meng's estate. The fan painting that we have here is a very kind of intimate form. This was originally, it's a round circular fan. It would have been placed on a frame so that Chen Ruzhi would be able to actually use this in the heat, would be able to cool himself with this. And what we see here is really a kind of ideal of reclusion. This, in the lower right-hand side, you can see that actually there's a pavilion. The pavilion is shielded and surrounded by trees. There's no deep space in this painting at all. Instead, everything is on the front part of it, in the fore and mid-ground here. And so it's sheltered, he's sheltered by trees. He's seated in this thatched pavilion overlooking some type of grasses, and perhaps behind him is water. We really can't tell. But what he's looking at is actually the poem itself. And that and here we can see a closer detail of the poet. There's some debate whether or not that poet, that the figure we actually see is Wang Meng, or if it's Chen Ruzhi. I have a tendency to feel it's Chen. But the whole poem itself is describing this sense of isolation, and ultimately then this strength of the individual. In the empty grove, the whistling wind makes the leaves dance. The thatched pavilion is lonely under the noonday sun. All day long, a southerly wind ripples the green waves. In a gauze cap of coarse hemp, one feels no trace of summer heat. This rustic's dwelling is near Yellow Crane Peak. In the evening, he enters a deserted grotto and listens to the mountain rain. There's all kinds of associations here of hardship. The suggestion of wind is oftentimes associated with hardship. The fact that he's talking about the noonday sun, it could be very blazing, but also then you get a sense that the figure himself, and again directed to Chen, is able to resist that, because it talks about how even in this gauze cap of coarse hemp, he doesn't feel any summer's heat at all. And at the very end of it, in the evening, he refreshes himself. He goes to a deserted grotto. Again, this emphasis on isolation as being a part of this reclusion, but listens to mountain rain. And the sound of rain can have multiple associations. It can be in the context of this, because it is against the dryness of the noonday sun. You get a sense, at least for me, I get a sense of how this is something that would be refreshing. And it tells a period of time from noon to the evening here of this sense of isolation and reclusion, but also describes it in ways that gives us a very rich sense of the place in which this person is, the elegance of that, also the sound of the landscape itself, and the grotto that we have there. I want to turn to the Ming Dynasty, which is Chinese rule, so restoration of Chinese rule, but all is not always well. There are problems here as well. We do not have, during this period, the Yimin, the loyalists that have refused service to a foreign government. Instead, reclusion takes a different form. It has different meanings. It's no longer an aspect of political protest. Instead, the ideal of reclusion and retreat in the Ming Dynasty is described as this kind of to escape the confines and demands of public life, and to court and official life, and instead to pursue painting and poetry and scholarship. But there's a lot of reclusion and that is expressed or takes place because of economic and social changes that occur in the Ming Dynasty, and this sense then of being out of sync with the world. I guess I would describe it as being that feeling of being a square peg and round hole, as being an aspect of this as well. So, and perhaps this is one of the best examples to show this. Shenzhou, this is a painting by Shenzhou, who's perhaps the most indelible image of the Confucian scholar gentleman, a person that seems to be detached from the cares of the world. Shenzhou is an artist that is still seen with great affection in the history of China. He lived in retirement. He never took civil service exams, although he was educated to do so. He lived on his family estate that was about a day's journey outside of Suzhou. He was also described as the founder of the Wu School of Painting, which is not a school so much as it is essentially a group and a style and theme of painting. So this is his painting called Walking with a Staff from 1485. And the theme is wandering in nature. And you have to look a little bit before you finally see him. And he's underneath that lower copse of trees there, walking across a bridge. He's shown by himself. He is losing himself in nature. This is an ideal in reclusion, to lose oneself in nature, to be filled up, to nourish the noble self. We know this is Shenzhou because he always paints himself into his own works. And because he's also the poet here, it becomes this full package of personal expression. So here he's shown crossing this bridge. He's wearing a robe, a traveler's hat, he's carrying a staff, and he's accompanied here then, or he's not accompanied by a servant, walking across this rushing stream. And however, it's very clear to us as we're looking at this, that there's multiple things going on. This is an enormous landscape. He's very, very tiny. And the poem itself is very interesting. It's rather ambiguous. The mountain is quiet, as if in remote antiquity. My thoughts are tranquil and harmonious. In blissful leisure, forgetting all worldly care, I live peacefully among rocks and streams. White clouds charm a visitor on the cliff. A fresh breeze sweeps through the barren bamboos and trees. Walking alone, without a companion, softly, gently lilting, I recite a verse. It sounds like he's walking actually through this landscape, through nature, but it's actually rather ambiguous. Is he walking through, as he describes, antiquity? Is he walking through and thinking of scholarship? Is he walking through a painting? And the reason why I say this is maybe you recognize this lower copse of trees here, because what he is doing is he is drawing on Nizan's work. In the foreground, in the background is it's recalling a painting also from the Yuan Dynasty, an early Yuan painter named Huang Gongwang that we don't have time to talk about. But he uses the motifs and brush styles of earlier artists. It's not only for the artistic interest, but is it also then here referring to their character, their purity, their resilience is the reason why he's choosing this. That's a very deliberate choice of what he's doing. And we can see here on the left-hand side in Shen's painting, this stacked composition with the multiple trees. We can see also the kind of horizontal dots. We can see how very spindly the trees are and how they actually remind us of Nizan's work at the right. So it looks like a very ideal life that Shenzhou is living, but actually in reality it was not. And that drawing upon these Yuan Dynasty painters, he is referring to that resilience and trying to draw that to himself. Because during Shenzhou's lifetime, and especially this 50-year period from the 1430s to 1480s, Suzhou was experiencing tremendous economic shifts and changes that contributed to the decline in the Shen's family finances. He was a farmer. The land prices were devalued. The taxes went way high. And as a farmer and landowner also, this was a period of natural disasters, because the area was ravaged by yearly cycles of floods and famines, destructions of crops, mass starvations and epidemics, these hardships that seem to really resonate with us right now. And that this was actually not even limited to China. This is a climate phenomenon of which, again, is not man-made. But this was the worldwide sporotroph of cooling that happened in the 15th century. It affected crops and certainly society in Western Europe as well. So Shenzhou doesn't paint that. He's not depicting that sense of loss. Instead, what he is painting is this resilience in using here Nizan as an example. He does, however, write poems about this sense of loss, and a poem that is done at the same time as this painting we're seeing here on the left at 1485. He wrote a poem called A Painting of Peach Blossom Spring. And it goes like this. Boys and girls are crying with hunger all over the village, and the tax collector at every door. The old man, unable to fall asleep at night, finds brush and paper, starts work on a painting of Peach Blossom Spring. This poem leads us back to Tal Chen, who wrote Returning Home and who was the subject of Chen Xuan's painting, but it cites Tal Chen's most famous story, which is that of the Peach Blossom Spring, which is about a utopia, a lost utopia that was accidentally discovered by a fisherman when he was out on his boat. He found a village that had been separated and had been cut off for several hundred years, didn't know there was a new dynasty. Everything was harmonious. And he spent a couple days there. And of course, then as we would possibly understand with concepts of utopia. He left to go back to try to get his family and bring them back, and they could never find it again. So it's that sense of loss, that sense of a utopia that is no longer there, of harmonious times, is part of Shenzhou's life, and he writes about that really extensively. If there was ever a model of perseverance in Chinese history, and especially in Ming Dynasty painting, it is Wenzhang Ming, and who tried and failed the provincial civil service exam 10 times. He was finally given an honorary position at the Hanlin Academy. He went there in the 1420s and 30s. I think it was, can't quite remember what date it was, but this was a time of tremendous political controversy in Beijing, and a time where there was too much court intrigue. He was absolutely miserable. He spent 3 years there and then returned back to Suzhou, and was able to take up residence in what is the Zhuozhang Yuan, who the garden described here as the garden of the inept administrator. It's also known as the garden of the humble administrator, the garden of the failed politician. The Lanzhou Garden actually is in part related to and draws upon themes from this Zhuozhang Yuan, the garden of the, in this case, inept administrator. It's a very self-effacing title that the owner of the garden gave it, Wang Shenchen, who was a friend of Wenzhang Ming's. But there is a certain cachet of failure that happens in Suzhou in the 16th century. And that is a part of that as well, this whole self-effacing. It is that theme of not living, being out of sync with time, of square peg, round hole. And so Wenzhang Ming painted two entire albums of this. This one is dated in 1551. He is over 80 years old when he is painting this. Wang Shenchen gave him his own studio there. He went there every day to paint. But what I wanted to point out is the quality of the ink in this. The theme itself, here you have gentlemen scholars. We could tell he's a scholar, an official, because he's wearing a cap. And here he and a friend are out looking at, turn to look out this pavilion, and are looking at a crane, a dancing crane. Cranes are symbolic of longevity. They're also symbolic of virtue, and especially that they respond to virtue by dancing. The other thing is the bamboo that's all around it. We talked about bamboo as a symbol of the scholar. Also the very silvery tones of ink. He is referring to the elegance and resilience of Nizan in this as well. Wenzhang Ming, for personal symbols, that oftentimes these artists are using then landscape themes, images that we see like this, in order to depict themselves. And Wenzhang Ming is especially known for his paintings of cypress and pine trees and rock as being personal symbols. This is one of the most extraordinary paintings by Wenzhang Ming. Old Trees by a Cold Waterfall from 1549. He's essentially 80 years old by this time as well. It's done in ink and color on silk. It's a large painting, I think about 5 feet tall. And that it's very narrow. It's like we are standing in a chasm, looking up, almost just, again, slot canyon in some ways, looking up and seeing this waterfall that's cascading down. You get a sense of the roar of the sound as that water must be falling down. It rushes down in the lower portion in the stream. On the right-hand side is a detail of this lower portion of the screen of this painting, where you have this very contorted cypress, that is twisted and clinging on to those rocks, that it has lived for a very long time. And then up on the left-hand side of the screen of the paintings are these two pine trees that are ascending up to the top. You get a sense of power and authority and tenacity in images like this. Wenzhang Ming is really kind of depicting himself. I think one of the most moving paintings of the Ming Dynasty that emphasizes ideas of friendship is this example, done in 1550. Again, all these Wenzhang Ming paintings are about the same time, that is called Old Cypress and Rock. And this is a small hand scroll. This is in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, which has a fabulous collection of Chinese painting. This was a painting and poem that was made for a young friend who was ill. So what Wen is doing here is combining those themes of rocks and cypress as we have, which we know he uses to depict himself, and kind of the solidity that one has of those rocks. And they look like those Taihu rocks, those beautiful, elegant Taihu rocks that the scholars' rocks that are in the Lanzhou Garden. And closer detail that we have here, this total control of the ink, the dryness that we have in the dry ink over the surface of the rock itself, and the kind of richness that we have in the foliage of the cypress, in parts that are dyed and parts that are, again, burgeoning in life. That what we have in this painting then, this is accompanied by a poem. Crushed by snow, oppressed by frost, as the years and months pass, branches twisted, its crown bent down, its strength is still majestic. An old man remembers Du Ling's words. The cypress impressed the world even before revealing its rich bark pattern. Zhang Ming sketched this descent to the graduate Bo Qi. Bo Qi was a young graduate, a scholar who was facing a very serious illness. And this is Wenzhang Ming's get well message to him, and that he is referring then to a cypress tree that, of course, is extremely tenacious. And at the third, where he talks about remembering Du Ling's words, an old man is Wenzhang Ming. The cypress impressed the world even before revealing its rich bark pattern, is referring to Bo Qi as a young scholar, that Wenzhang Ming perceives his potential, and that to not give up, basically. So this also, again, symbols of resilience and of tenacity and of hope is really expressed in a painting like this. I just want to leave you with a couple of other ideas, and I know we are now out of time. In the 16th century, there are many paintings of scholars in retreats, portraits of scholars in their own retreats, what are described as hall paintings or bier hall paintings. They are sobriquet paintings. They are visual treatment of the patron's style name. This is one of them by Zhou Chan, and who I'd love to be able to spend more time on, but we can't. And it's called the North Sea. And the reason why is because the scholar that we see there in his study, there's books behind him. He's out he's viewing this North Sea, this tremendous waves that are rushing up. The North Sea, Beiming, is his style name. And so it is a portrait of him in a garden that he created. And there are so many paintings like this of this particular theme because this is also, again, the time of the development of gardens. But one of the most important things about this, and what we see with representations of reclusion, is that you're never really alone. That even in reclusion, the ideal is to have friends. Because here in this painting, we can see a scholar and his servant who's carrying a musical instrument behind him. They're walking across this extremely rickety bridge. And what it looks like is that Bei Ming put up a few boards across something to allow people to walk through. It is a temporary bridge. And so he's walking across that. We have a sense that in fact, they will soon be greeted. He will soon be, Bei Ming will soon greet this friend here. And that eventually then, they'll be moving up to the top little pavilion there to have a better view of the water. But the other thing to notice about that is that there are 3 seats. Whether or not this means that we are invited or that there is another person that is going to be walking into the painting, that this idea of community, of a scholarly community, of close friends that are helping each other through these times of trouble is something that is extremely important in China. And I just want to then turn to this last one. Returning again to Shenzhou, who in 1486 had a party during the Mid-Autumn Festival, a banquet for a few close friends, where they sat in this, what's called the bamboo villa, which Shenzhou built on his estate in 1477. And that they sat and composed poetry, enjoyed each other's company, and looked at the moon. This is my hope. I think it's all of our hope that by the fall, we should be able to finally join together again and to support one another, to see each other at the end of this long pandemic and the end of what we consider as being our kind of forced reclusion in our life. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that wonderful presentation. Yeah, we're going to slide right into our Q&A session. We've gone a little long, but we had some longer introductory remarks, so that's totally fine. If anyone in the audience can't stay, that's no problem. But if you can, we'll get through some of these questions. So let's see, as a reminder, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. If you can't figure that out, just put it in the chat and we'll try to add it in. Okay. Great. So I'm going to start with a question. This was an early question from Linda, and she asks, what does the writing on the painting say? And I know you've gone into that, so I would add to that question is the writing always poetry, or are there other kinds of writing on the paintings?
There are many different kinds of writing. It depends on what period. In the Song Dynasty, we generally don't have scholars that are artists that are writing on their own paintings. They will have inscribed perhaps their name. But by the time we get to Shenzhou and Wenzhang Ming, where they're actually inscribing, writing poems on the paintings or writing a dedication on the paintings. But there are many different cases in which an individual painting then will have writing on it by other people. And this may be someone that came to like a party that we just saw, the Mid-Autumn Festival, that a participant would add then a poem later. But oftentimes there are situations where colophons, which are inscriptions that are added, they can be added centuries after the original painting was done, and the painting would be remounted and then added multiple sheets of paper. What that does is then create a biography, so for that painting, so that a collector or someone that would view that painting centuries on would be able to write about how they saw it and that whole situation and what they felt about it. So yeah, there's many situations like that with multiple types of writing on paintings.
Thank you so much for that answer. A follow-up question to that is, again, I think you've mentioned this in your talk already, but if you could remind us, where does the poetry come from, and what is the connection or the significance between the poetry coupled with the paintings?
The poetry can be composed by the person who's painting it. And I'm talking here really about Confucian scholar painting, because these people had a full knew extremely well the history of Chinese poetry and were able to quote it. Just and so it may be something that they are responding to. They can be quoting poems, they can be writing their own, but some of the kind of symbolism of what we have, when I talked about Yuan and Tao Qian, those are references to poems back in the 4th century with Tao Qian. So poetry can come from any number of sources. I don't know if that answers the question, but if I answered that correctly.
It does. Thank you so much. Let's go to the next one. It's actually a comment, and then if you have anything to add, that'd be great. Joanne says, Sunan Wen, interesting use of south-facing, since south-facing often stands for power.
Yes, you're exactly right. That it is through the south that the south is the most auspicious in feng shui. Yeah, I had not thought about that as being that case. Generally, with Sunan Wang, with Zheng Xiao's, that's understood generally as kind of turning away from the north, because that's the direction that the Mongols came. And that by the time we get to the Yuan Dynasty, that two Song dynasties had fallen, the north and then the south. And so, yeah, it could be both the idea of looking for an auspicious beginning and auspicious change as well.
Thank you. We'll jump into the next question, and that is, Dawn says, thank you for the lovely presentation. Could you tell us a little about landscape paintings produced closer to the contemporary moments? Do the sorts of meanings you describe in the Song, Yuan, and Ming dynasties continue in later periods or even today?
Yes, I'm gonna kind of think just post Ming, that as we move into the Qing dynasty, where it is again a foreign ruled dynasty, that we have a similar group of people that are Ming loyalists, that are known as Yimin then, and that are painting, using landscape painting as a way of expressing this sense of grief and loss and change, and having China, basically Chinese emperors usurped by foreign rulers. So that is still a theme that is important. The whole theme also of the peach blossom spring, that is the concept of utopia, remains to be a popular theme in the 20th century by several very important painters. And I didn't include one. I was originally going to include one. That concept of utopia. Certainly that's the case. It's used extensively in Qing Dynasty, which is from 1644 to 1911. In terms of contemporary landscape painting, I can't say that I am that familiar with those themes of either. There are some peach blossom springs, but they are still drawing upon, I would say, some of the brush styles. There are some more conservative painters, conservative traditions that really look to the past. And all the way back to the Yuan Dynasty, artists that in, again, 21st century are still working in that mode. They become codified, but also they still carry with them a lot of the the messages of taste, of resilience, of sophistication that we saw earlier. There are a lot of other factors that are coming into then concepts of landscape painting as we move into the 21st century. But there are still many artists that are working in traditional ink media.
Thank you so much for answering that question. Joanne asks, Yuan Ming's painting looks rather like a copy or reference to the detail in the Nizan painting. Is it a reference or rather just a standard scene?
Question is if Joanne's referring to the copse of trees or the pavilion. They were living at the same time. Actually, Yuan Ming is slightly younger. They probably knew of each other. I would say that the themes that we see, those motifs of trees and of pavilions and of scholars, by this time have become fairly standardized and are deployed in such a way to make reference to scholars and poets, such. So what you would see as being a kind of a quotation and reference to Nizan would be the very short pavilions that it looks like you can't even get underneath them because they're so short, and the treatment of the brushwork itself. But copses of trees and that suggest kind of wilderness or some type of garden, a kind of naturalness, that those are fairly standard.
Great, thank you. Another question's about the paintings and poetry. Gretchen asks, in the painting and poem to the ailing scholar, we were shown a close-up. I noticed the far edge of the rock formation at the extreme left. It looked like the faces of several lunging demons, one above the other. Is this significant? It hardly seems accidental.
My experience in teaching art history is that pretty much you can find faces in anything. I would think that it is not. I would think it was accidental. I'll have to go back and look at this. I've been teaching with this material for years, and I've never seen those faces. And as soon as somebody mentions that, however, you never see it the same way.
All right, next question is from, let's see, Sylvia. She asked, did Shenzhou also have a home in Suzhou?
His ancestral home was outside. It was in Changzhou, but he did spend a lot of time in Suzhou proper. And we know that because he would stay with friends. There are also, he would stay at monasteries or temples that had guest houses. There are many paintings that he did of topographical landscapes, of famous views in Suzhou, that it was really the center of culture during the time of the Ming Dynasty in which he lived, in the mid-Ming. It's where most of the scholars came from. It was an extremely rich city that in the mercantile society, the merchants were actually on social ascendance at this time, and it was predominantly through silk. So we know he was there a lot in terms of his own ancestral home, and in terms of the land that he owned, it was outside. It was about 10 miles outside.
Thank you, Anne. We've got a couple more questions. We're going to try to go through. Jolly asks, is the Suzhou Garden the administrator's garden today, the same one in the Wenzhang Ming's painting Garden of the Inuit administrator's garden?
It is the same. However, it is so changed that the Garden of the Humble Administrator was divided up, I think, in the Qing Dynasty, and then put back together. That there have been studies and certainly people that know that garden have compared Wenzhang Ming's paintings. He has two different albums. Have tried to compare his paintings with how it looks today, and it's very, very different. But yeah, that's the origin is the same. It is that garden.
Okay. Another connection to a reference. Pam asks, to what extent did artists reference books like the Mustard Seed Garden Manual of Painting dictate or suggest the use of motifs, such as double trees, to refer to a concept embedded into the meaning of the piece?
The Mustard Seed Manual actually emerges out of the whole tradition of Chinese painting. That the Mustard Seed Garden Manual and 10 Bamboo Studio, these were actually painting manuals that were produced beginning in the late Ming Dynasty. So they are drawing upon people like Shenzhou and earlier artists. That is where they're getting that. But there were they have not survived really at all. But we do believe that Chinese painters, especially that were working for the court, that they had some paintings that they would copy that had motifs that they would learn to be able to do that. So you're probably familiar with the Mustard Seed Manual, where it shows how to paint grasses under different conditions, in the rain or in the wind or something like that, how they grow. All of this is something that actually comes up through the whole tradition of painting and concepts of realism that was part from the 10th century on. I don't know if that answers the question, but one follows the other, and the Mustard Seed Manual is something that really follows the rest of the history of Chinese painting.
Great. We have two more questions. Sabina says, thank you, Dr. Wetherell, for a very wonderful, excellent presentation. Do paintings with written poems on it make the painting more appealing, especially if the poem was written by the painter? That helps the viewer to understand his true feelings.
Yes, I would say that's the case. That once we have writings on it by the artist, that it gives us a better sense of this whole concept of what they're thinking. That scholar painting especially is, and there's a sense of equivalence and belief in equivalence between a poetic image and a painted image, and how one extends the other. I did not bring in my favorite example that shows that where you have, it's another Shenzhou painting where he's on a mountaintop overlooking what you can't see, but instead in the poem it actually describes it. So you give a much greater sense of what is actually happening in his world because of that. In some cases with Zhang Mengzhen's paintings, that the first artist we looked at in the Song Dynasty, who was a scholar and a bureaucrat, he didn't write poems on the paintings, but instead what we have are additional colophons that are then people that are writing about how they interpreted it. So that also has a significant appeal, because you get a sense of how that painting is seen through history. So if there is a poem on a painting, it is important to at least know what it says, at least have some idea, if you can, of what it says, because it can dramatically change then the meaning of that painted image.
That's lovely. Thank you. Leonora asks, do you have a favorite among these images?
Oh, yes. I have many favorites. The painting of Walking with the Staff by Shenzhou that I showed. Seeing that was the reason why I ended up writing my PhD on him. And just because I felt I was so moved by that painting and his expression of linking to the past and where he saw himself in that. And that I saw that in person. I describe paintings as seeing them like in person. And when you get a chance to do that, it's you really get a sense of the painting, and especially because you are able to see the kind of depth of and the quality of the paper and the whole thing. And it just felt like he had just painted that. So that is one of my favorites. And also Wenzhang Ming's painting of the cypress and old rock that I showed you, or old cypress and rock, which is one of the first Chinese paintings I actually ever saw. That is in the collection of the Nelson Atkins Museum, and just is very, very absorbing.
We've got one more question, and that is from Jeff. Are the paintings in the museums available for viewing online?
Many of what I've put up here are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And that is one of the best places to go onto their website, and you can do a search for Shenzhou, Wenzhang Ming, Nizan, any of these artists I've shown you, that they have really high resolution images that you can blow up, look at very, very carefully at. The paintings in the National Palace Museum in Taipei sometimes are on display. The ones in the Metropolitan may not be on display, but you can generally see really good photos of them. The stuff is in rotation. That Chinese paintings are rather fragile because they are on silk or paper that they can only be displayed for a short time, and then they have to be rested because the materials interact then with the humidity and the environment. So preservation of the paintings is of the first order. I have been known to go to a museum when I know a particular painting is out that I can see, and to make a special trip for that. So if you're going to go to any of these museums, see what you can find out actually what's available, and go see them.
Oh, that's fabulous. We are at the end of our Q&A time. I see there are a couple more questions coming in. If you're able to join us at the tea house, we will definitely ask those there. And then I will also ask Anne, and we might get back to you on email.
Sure.
So again, we're at the end of our Q&A, and so thank you so much for spending your morning with us, Anne. I do want to give you the chance if you have any last comments you'd like to make.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. And I hope that we will be able to be together by the fall, by the time of the Mid-Autumn Festival. And in the meantime, just take good care of yourselves.
Yes, a great reminder to all of us. I second that. So really quick, just a reminder, we're going to head into our tea house. We'll take a few minutes and probably start it up in maybe 11:30. So if you have a chance, grab a cup of tea. And then a reminder, you'll have to leave the webinar and then rejoin the tea house with the link, the second link on your confirmation email. And I apologize. I forgot to mention next month's presentation. And that is titled Simmering, Whisking, Steeping, Methods for Preparing and Consuming Tea in Pre-Modern China with Dr. James Ben. Information is on our website and registration is open, and we'll be sending out our announcement as well. So with that, I thank everyone for joining us today and sticking with us for our extended Q&A. And we hope to see you at the Tea House, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you.
You.
Bye.